as far as his mind and soul is concerned, he's ready to move on. And I think a lot of times we need to be thinking along those lines as well. We will read Matthew's and John's accounts in just a few moments. Later in, probably more on Wednesday night than today. But I'd like for us to, at least for now, read Matthew's account. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 26, beginning with verse 47. Matthew 26, beginning with verse 47. And notice that even Matthew's account says, "Arise, let us be going." And now we read in verse 47, "And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, 'Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him.' And immediately he went up to Jesus and said, 'Greetings, Rabbi,' and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, 'Friend, why have you come?' Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. But Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels?' How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?" In that hour Jesus said to the multitudes, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." I want us to think about this for a moment. Suppose you were one of the apostles that were present with Jesus in the garden that evening, when all this is coming about, and you see Judas coming, and we're going to be talking about the large company of people coming, and they have clubs and swords and lanterns and so on. What would you do? How would you respond to something like this?
The disciples fled, right?
Not yet. They haven't fled. I'm asking, what would you have done right now?
I'd protect myself.
Yeah, which is rather interesting. You think about just 12 of them plus the Lord, well, only 11 of them right now, plus the Lord, and one of the apostles coming with all these people. What would you do? Remember where we are in the life of Christ. It's now Friday. It's in the early mornings, the day of his death. He had been warning of this moment, but the apostles themselves didn't quite understand. They had just had a night to remember with the Lord. Just think about what has happened just in the last several hours. He observed the Last Supper, which is the Passover. There is that conflict with Judas, and Judas leaves the group. He institutes the Lord's Supper. His last exhortations, as you read exclusively from John's Gospel to his apostles. And then his prayers. So we have the prayer for unity recorded in John chapter 17. Now he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And all this has happened within a matter of hours. Undoubtedly, they were exhausted and they were tired. And then all of a sudden, an angry mob appears. Now just picture yourself as being one of the apostles, and you're standing there with Jesus in this little garden. We talked about how small that garden was. And all these people are coming. What would you do?
Because I used to know where to run.
You know, I think you're right, because what do we know about the Garden of Gethsemane?
It was walled.
It was a walled garden.
So they kind of backed up against the wall.
So there wouldn't be any way to get out. Although, as Sister Shelby said, they will eventually flee when he is arrested. But what would you try to do? Would you try to run?
Yeah.
As she says unhesitatingly.
I kind of really what Peter side from that sword.
Would you stand and fight for Jesus? You know, sometimes we really come down hard on the apostles. Well, they couldn't even stay awake, you know, and they're not understanding things about the kingdom. They're so dense, you know. They don't understand these things. I want you to consider this for a moment. I think they thought that they were going to go into battle. Jesus had already told them to have a sword. And they had two of them. He says, that's enough. And we see one of the apostles drawing a sword and cutting off an ear, right? I think this is what's going on in their mind when they come back to Jerusalem. I think Jesus has prepared them for this, although they did not understand. I'd like for us to revisit the parable of the minas. We won't read it all the way through. It's recorded in Luke chapter 19, verses 11 through 28. And this parable is rather similar to the parable of the talents that we're more familiar with in Matthew chapter 25. But the difference in these two parables, and what makes the parable of the minas stand out, is the different way in which it begins and it ends. For instance, look at Luke chapter 19 and verse 11. I invite you to read along with me. And I'll explain to you in just a moment at what point Jesus issued this parable. Again, Matthew 19 and verse 11. It says, now as they heard these things, he spoke another parable because he was near Jerusalem. Now listen to this. And because they thought the kingdom of God would appear immediately. That is what they were expecting. They didn't have any idea about Pentecost or anything like that. But they thought that when they'd come into Jerusalem, that's what would happen. Now consider what happens after the parable. Go down to verse 24. And it reads, and he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to him who had 10 minas. Again, that's very similar to the parable of the talents. But they said to him, Master, he has 10 minas. For I say to you that to everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Now read this. But bring here those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, and slay them before me. When he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. That's pretty much the last thing that we read before he's going to make a short visit to Bethany. But Bethany is just outside of Jerusalem. And then what happens? When Jesus enters Jerusalem, how is he received? In what way, Steve? What do we call it? The palm leaves and so on, the triumphant entry and so on. At this particular point, what do you think the apostles are thinking? At last, here's the king. He's right now going to set up his kingdom. And he doesn't. And now here they are in the garden, and he's being arrested. I don't know if we can really appreciate how confusing that must have been to the apostles.
Would we have understood it ourselves?
I don't think we would have understood it either. And yet we will stand in judgment of them, and we will shake our heads. And I'd ask you, what would you do in a situation like that where, and we're talking about hundreds of people, and they are soldiers coming for you, and you have two swords. And some of you said, I would have run.
Or two, with charges wall and nobody else.
You're trapped in there pretty much. So you're fighting for your life. But what do the apostles do?
Eventually fled.
Let's not talk about eventually fled. Peter will eventually deny Jesus too. I'm asking you, what did they do right then? They stood by Jesus, didn't they? And many of us have said, man, I'd gotten out of there. We don't want to be hurt. It's easy for us, as Monday morning quarterbacks, being very critical of the apostles. But they had put their trust in Jesus. And this was a very difficult thing for them to do. You see, they were looking for and they were expecting an earthly kingdom. Good morning, Brad, right? Glad to have you back with us. So they're looking forward to and expecting an earthly kingdom. And when you start putting these various points together, I think we have a better appreciation, understanding why Judas did what he did. You had the triumphant entry. They thought, okay, Jesus is going to become king, and we're going to be in the kingdom and all that type of thing, and we're ready to get on with it. And it hasn't been happening that way this week. And I really think that Judas was trying to press Jesus' hand. I think he was trying to get him to do what he expected him to do, what the other apostles expected him to do. And he didn't. And consequently, when you read this passage and you compare it, say, with Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 through 5, Judas is very surprised at what happened. We're going to see that the text will read, when Judas saw that Jesus was condemned, he came back and threw the money back on the tables and saying, I have sinned, that I have betrayed innocent blood. Judas did not expect Jesus to be arrested. He did not expect him to be condemned. Now he sees he's going to be tried and crucified. And what does he do? He takes his own life, doesn't he?
That he dies before Jesus does.
Yes, he does. He dies before Jesus does. So if you were there in the garden while Jesus was being arrested, would you just stand there and watch what's going on? Yes.
If he wasn't expecting Jesus to be arrested and crucified, what was he?
He thought he would get out of that mess as he has before.
Walk right through it.
Maybe walk through it, escape. He's done that before. In fact, we're going to get into the question as to why they brought so many people.
Yeah, that's the one part.
That's an overkill, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like trying to kill an ant with a bomb, you know. It's an overkill because they have tried before without success. And now they feel like they got him trapped in the garden, as Steve pointed out, and we mentioned before. This is a walled garden. He cannot get out. And if he does, he's going to have to pass through all these people to get out of there. And you know, and we'll get into this. You start scratching your head and say, how in the world were the Jews able to convince the Romans to send so many soldiers? And we'll talk about how many there were in just a moment.
In fact, there was also the temple police there.
Yes, we're going to be talking about the temple police as well, which should have been sufficient in of itself to do it. But they hadn't been able to do it. And not only that, they want him arrested to be tried and put to death, which they didn't really have the power to do. They need the cooperation of the Romans. And so all these things happen during this moment in the life of Christ. I don't think we can really grasp the whole story when we just read one gospel account. And so, as I mentioned to you before, these events are recorded in all four Gospels. We just read Matthew's account in Matthew chapter 26. Why don't we go over to John chapter 18, see what John has to say about this? John 18, and we're going to begin with verse 2 of our reading. And as always, John always has a different perspective, and we've noticed before that of the four Gospels, you've got to be careful mostly with John with the order of events. John has his own purpose for writing. And beginning with verse 2 of John 18, and Judas, who betrayed him, who knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received, here's one word here, a detachment. Does anybody have a different translation here? A band. The New American Standard says a cohort. Cohort. C-O-H-O-R-T, cohort. And we'll talk about what that, it says a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees came with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward. Isn't that amazing? Not drew back. He walked toward them walked forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. We'll have a little time to talk about that too. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." None of his disciples are going to be harmed or killed. Then Simon Peter, it's John who tells us who's the one who pulled the sword. It says, "Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus." So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" Then the detachment of the troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Again, you're seeing the confusion of the apostles. You say, well, what is Peter doing with the sword? He told his apostles to get a sword. And so undoubtedly Peter says, well, that's why we have it. But it was not the time to use it. That would come later. And so later on we're going to be looking at Mark's account as well as Luke's. Let's review the scene a little bit. From what we've read already, we find that the mob comes. The Bible says they came while Jesus was still speaking to his disciples there in the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a crowd. Some versions say a large crowd. And when you start adding up the people, yes, it was a large crowd. And we know that they were accompanied by a cohort of Roman soldiers. So we're talking about hundreds of people coming to get Jesus. Who was there? Judas was leading them. He led the mob to the Mount of Olives, John chapter 18 and verse 2, a place where he knew that Jesus often met with his disciples. Matthew and Mark tell us that the chief priests, scribes, and elders were there also. In other words, we're talking about the Sanhedrin. What's the Sanhedrin, or Sanhedrin, which is probably the better pronunciation, but doesn't sound right to us. What is that? That's the Jewish authority. It's their government, basically, their religious government. Luke and John says officers of the temple who were from the chief priests were there. In other words, the Jewish security force for the temple was present as well. And of course, as we mentioned before, we have the Roman soldiers there. John uses, the Gospel of John uses the word cohort, which you find in the New American Standard Bible. That's not the word, we don't find the word that is in the Greek in any of the translations. The word there is spira. But here's the interesting thing about this detachment, the size of it. It was 1/10 of a Roman legion. How many were in a legion? 6,000.
We have 600.
So there were 600 Roman soldiers alone, besides the temple police and and the religious authorities from the Sanhedrin. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people. Well, that's what we brought up before. Why? Why is that? That's right. They want to make sure he does not escape because he has escaped before. Even early in his ministry. Was there not a time in which they wanted to throw him off a cliff? And he passed right through them.
Because it wasn't his time.
That's right, because it wasn't his time. But now it is his time, and he will allow himself to be arrested and condemned to the chagrin of Judas. Are we understanding what's going on in the scene right here? And perhaps why Judas behaved the way he did? Now, we know he had character flaws. I mean, he was already a thief. But he was trying to manipulate Jesus. And Jesus would not allow himself to be manipulated because he was on a time schedule, doing the Father's will. Yes, Shirley?
Are you going to bring out why there's a different account of Judas in Matthew, as far as him kissing Jesus? And then you've got John saying that Jesus came forward.
He came forward, and I don't think John says he kissed him. Let's see. I got it right here.
Or no, he didn't, but Matthew did. In Matthew.
Yeah. Let's see.
No.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke says that Judas kissed Jesus. It's not found in John's account.
No, and Matthew said Jesus came forward.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't, they weren't given a sign of the kiss to point him out.
Well, John doesn't mention it. John wasn't under obligation to mention it.
But it is a whole different account. I mean,
That's what we've been saying all along, how John's account is different for the purpose for which he wrote his gospel.
He didn't wait for Judas to come to him. He went forward.
That's right. In fact, he went forward toward the mob.
But why
Yeah.
was he?
And when he says, I am he, they're the ones who fell back. The other gospel accounts do not record that.
Why do you think that is, though? Has that ever been studied why there's such a difference?
Because of what the purpose for which John is writing. We warned from the very beginning of this study that when you're looking at a harmony of the Gospels, don't look for a chronology. That's not the purpose of the harmony. And all of us, we're saying, well, what other reason is there for studying the harmony of the Gospels? That's just the way I'm programmed. I want to know what happened then and what happened here. And why weren't some of these things mentioned that the other Gospel accounts mention? Each writer has his own purpose. And when we start trying to study the harmony purely on chronological issues, we get ourselves in trouble. Now, generally speaking, Matthew and Mark will always agree. Sometimes you have a little bit of variation with Luke. But the Gospel of John is the gospel of faith. He is there to present who Jesus is. He is the Son of God so that we might believe in him. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention the fact that that Jesus stands forward and the people fall back. This is how the Son of God behaves in this particular situation. And John presents it to us.
But without John, though, we would never know.
Well, that'd be true.
I mean,
For-
to me,
It sure does.
And if you're only studying Matthew's account, you're seeing a whole different than what.
That's right. And you're going to find some more information in Luke that you don't find in Matthew.
What you also have to remember too is, besides all these, there's only two eyewitnesses who actually, at that time, who wrote the gospel, Matthew and John.
Right. You know, it's like people witnessing a traffic accident. And the police call people in and say, "Tell me what you saw." And a man will come along and says, "Well, I saw these two cars coming at the intersection, and one car hit the other, and he went through the light and so on." And then they'll come across a woman, and what's she going to tell them? Well, the woman driving was wearing a blue hat. Well, the man didn't mention anything about that. But each gospel account gives its own testimony. And remember, Luke is the historian. He doesn't claim to be there. There is a possibility that Mark was there. Each one is writing by inspiration, and including what we need to know. We could very well ask the question, well, why don't we have a fifth gospel? Well, some people have tried to supply that. It's called the pseudepigrapha. Yeah. Okay, so what did they bring? They had weapons, swords, and clubs. They had lanterns and torches. Maybe they needed these as they were going to get Jesus. Maybe they thought that they were going to run when they showed up. And so if they tried to escape, and I think they were very confident that they were in a place, they had him cornered in a place where he couldn't get out. But you remember, even after the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, it does seem that he suddenly appeared in a room with his apostles.
The door was locked too.
And the door was locked. So we are told specifically concerning that, aren't we? Which tells us, had Jesus wanted to, he could have gotten out of that mess. Go ahead, Brother Suresh.
No, just supporting that Luke, as he was trying to show the perfect man, his gospel says he even healed
Right, the fellow who lost his ear. Yeah, isn't that something? Luke was not only a historian, he was a physician. Kind of a unique perspective, isn't it? When we look at it. Well, our time is just about up. I wanted us to go ahead and read. Well, let's at least read Mark's account, Mark 14:43, because our time is just about up this morning. Mark 14, and we're going to start with verse 43. It says, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely. You often wonder, if they knew who Jesus was, why did they need Judas? But he is the accuser. He is the accuser. And as soon as he had come, immediately he went up to Jesus and said to him, Rabbi, Rabbi, and kissed him. Then they laid their hands on him and took him. It's at this particular point, I wonder what Judas was thinking. I wonder what crossed his mind when he saw Jesus allowing himself to be arrested like this. And one of them who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. In other words, this isn't going to happen. Then Jesus answered and said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then they all forsook him and fled. Now they flee, because they see that he's going to allow himself to be arrested. What has Jesus said to them on a number of occasions, even before they arrived in Jerusalem? They're going to strike the shepherd. I'm going up to Jerusalem. I'm going to be turned over to my enemies. I'm going to die. And they refuse to believe that, because that can't happen to our king. Now a certain young man followed him with a linen cloth thrown around his naked body, and the young man laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. That's how fast it happens. Tell you what, this is probably a good place to stop. We are going to continue with this Wednesday evening, and I want you to read through all 4 gospel accounts and see if you want to write some things down, what each one reports, and what gospels report the same thing and other gospels do not. I've done that here, and I'd like to discuss it with you because the question comes up. It's a good question, particularly when we're looking at the Gospel of John. Why is John so different? And it all comes back to the point that we forget why the Gospels were written. After all, wouldn't one gospel account been sufficient? And yet we have 4, don't we? And Matthew tells you from the very beginning that he's there to present the King of the Jews. Mark, of course, the Son of Man. We got Luke, as Brother Suresh pointed out, God's perfect man. And of course, John's going to continually stress to us, this Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God. He's deity.
When he answers him and says, I am he is actually man himself, what he says is on him.
Yeah.
His God is
I have to go back and see if that would be what's called the AME construction, whether that's intended there. Usually it just says, I am. And you have that, say, at the end of John chapter 8. Before Abraham was, I am. And on that statement, they wanted to stone him, didn't they? So these are very significant statements. And usually identify 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. Such as, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the bread of life, John chapter 6. I am the way, the truth, and the life, John 14:6. All of these are claims that he makes for himself. Okay, well, our time is a little past gone here, so we'll stop.